Today, we're diving into William Dalrymple's absolutely incredible book, The Anarchy, and it tells one of the most unbelievable stories in history. It's about how a single corporation, a for-profit company, managed to conquer the mighty Mughal Empire, a power that ruled over a fifth of the entire world's population.
And that really is the central, mind-boggling question of the whole book. Seriously, how does that even happen? Because, it wasn't a king or a nation-state that first conquered India. It was a private English trading company run by a handful of guys out of a single tiny London office that was just 5 windows wide. The politician Edmund Burke, he just nailed it. He famously called the East India Company, or the EIC, quote, a state in the guise of a merchant. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. This was a business, a for-profit enterprise that had its own army, its own laws, and, in the end, its very own empire.
But, it didn't start out that way. Not even close. To really understand how this company turned into a predator, we've got to go back to its surprisingly humble beginnings, when its only goal, its entire reason for being, was just to turn a profit, not conquest. The first investors, way back in 1599, they were a real motley crew. On the one hand, you had these respectable, portly London merchants, grocers, drapers, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, you had scarred sea dogs, tough mariners, and men who called themselves privateers, which, let's be honest, was just a polite Elizabethan way of saying pirates. And in the beginning, the power imbalance was just staggering. In the early 1600s, you've got the Mughal Empire, a global superpower producing a full 25% of all the world's manufactured goods. And then you have the EIC, this tiny company, so insignificant that its own ambassador told them that for a business like theirs, war and trade were just incompatible. And get this, the company wasn't even a big deal among its European competitors. Its starting capital was barely a tenth of its powerful Dutch rival. I mean, looking at these numbers, this whole enterprise seemed destined for total failure. So what changed? What was the pivot? Well, this is the crucial point Dalrymple makes. The company's rise was only possible because of the Mughal Empire's spectacular fall. The opportunity didn't come from the EIC's strength, but from an empire that had started to completely crack from the inside. And this collapse happened in stages. First, in 1707, the death of the pretty divisive Emperor Aurangzeb. That kicks off a whole period of instability. Then, in 1739, you get the killer blow. The Persian warlord Nader Shah invades. By the 1740s, the once mighty empire had just shattered into this mosaic of smaller, much more vulnerable states. Nader Shah's invasion was an absolute catastrophe for the Mughals. He didn't just beat their army, he sacked the capital, Delhi, and literally hauled away the entire imperial treasury. We're talking priceless treasures including the legendary Peacock Throne and the Kohinoor Diamond. He left the empire bankrupt and just utterly broken. An Indian historian writing at the time, he just captured the mood perfectly. The old world, the stable, prosperous world of the Mughals, was gone. It was replaced by chaos and violence. He wrote that it felt like the world itself was being overwhelmed with darkness. And this power vacuum, this darkness, was the exact opening the East India Company had been waiting for. This is where it begins its stunning transformation, from a humble trading firm into a ruthless military power. This is where the merchants become the masters. And the architect of this whole change was one of history's most unlikely characters, a guy named Robert Clive. He started out as a low-level company clerk, somebody his own father described as morose and difficult. But out in India, he discovered he had this hidden genius for military command and, maybe more importantly, for ruthless political scheming. The big turning point was the so-called Battle of Plassey in 1757. But let's be really clear about this. This was less of a battle and much more of a hostile corporate takeover. Clive basically conspired with a disgruntled general in the opposing army, bribed him to have his troops just stand down, and then easily routed the now leaderless force. And with that one act of betrayal, the company seized control of Bengal, the single richest province in all of India. So if Plassey was a conspiracy, then the Battle of Buxar, 7 years later, that was a raw display of military might. This time, the company's private army defeated the combined forces of 3 different Indian rulers, including the Mughal emperor himself. After Buxar, the EIC wasn't just a corporation anymore. It had become a company state, a private business that ruled like a government.
So what did this new corporate state do with all its power? Well, in Bengal, the result was one of the greatest tragedies in the province's history. And it was all driven by this toxic mix of plunder, mismanagement, and just pure corporate greed. Just a few years after the company took charge, a horrific famine struck. Now, it was triggered by a drought, but it was made infinitely worse by the company's brutal policies. An estimated 1.2 million people died. To put that in perspective, that was 1 out of every 5 people in Bengal. And the company's official response? In their report back to London, they wrote this: "Even as millions were starving to death, they were proudly reporting an increase in their tax revenues." They were literally sending soldiers into the countryside to violently extract taxes from starving families. It's just chilling. Even some of the company's own officials were horrified. One of them, a man named Alexander Dow, wrote this absolutely devastating summary of what his own employer had done. He said Bengal had been asset stripped, picked clean, like a carcass bleaching in the wind. But here's the ultimate irony. The company's ruthless plundering of Bengal almost destroyed itself. They looted so much, so fast, that they crashed the local economy, which then led to their own bankruptcy. And it triggered one of history's first ever government bailouts. The company had become, you guessed it, too big to fail. The British government was basically forced to step in with something called the Regulating Act of 1773. It was a massive loan to save the company from completely collapsing, but it came with a huge price tag. For the very first time, the state claimed the right to regulate the affairs of this rogue corporation. And from this point on, that line between the company and the state just gets blurrier and blurrier until it disappears completely. In 1803, the company's army captures Delhi and makes the Mughal Emperor their own personal prisoner. And then finally, in 1858, the British Crown ends the whole charade and takes formal control, officially creating the British Raj.
The East India Company was eventually dissolved, but its story is just this chilling, powerful warning about what happens with unchecked corporate power. It's a reminder of how a for-profit entity, one that's accountable only to its shareholders, can subvert states, command private armies, and act with a kind of ruthless impunity that's just hard to fathom. Which really leaves us with a question for our own time, doesn't it? What can this 200-year-old story teach us about corporate power today?